So, we continue with discussion of answers. Number 12 is D, Epsilon by William Faulkner. And where is it set? Number 13, B, during the Civil War 1861 to 1865. Okay, that was about the anti-slavery uh, abolitionist movement. That war was related to that movement. Abraham Lincoln at the helm of the affairs. So, William Faulkner, the Nobel winning novelist, he was born in 1897 and lived till 1962. He came from an old southern family just like Tennessee Williams. He grew up in Mississippi part of it and joined the Canadian and later the British Royal Army Force during the First World War. There he had some personal reasons for joining the army. He studied for a while at the University of Mississippi and sets his stories in the imaginary Yoknepetewa County. We have R. K. Narayan writing in the imaginary Malgudi. We have seen that in the when we were talking about Indian writing in English in week 7. So, this is again an imaginary space. So, what did he write about? Basically, his stories deal with the decay of the Old South. Again, a Tennessee Williams kind of a theme. And most of his stories, the decay is represented by the families Sartoris, Compson, Snopes. So, Sartoris and Compson, they are the old established families now in the process of decay, and I mean they are losing their status, and the emergence of the new money, the brash newcomers as they say, the nouveau riche Snopes. In 1940, he published the first volume of the Snopes trilogy, which was called The Hamlet, to be followed by 2 volumes, The Town and The Mansion. And all these works trace the rise of the evil, insidious Snopes family to position of power and wealth, at the same time chronicling the decay of the old established order. In Epsilon, which was 1936 novel and considered by many his best work, his masterpiece, it's a story of someone called Thomas Sutpen, yeah, who arrives in Jefferson from so-called nowhere and carves a large plantation out of the wilderness in Mississippi and fights in the Civil War in defense of his adopted society, but is ultimately destroyed by the people around him, and because some of the people he has misused and cast aside in his obsessive pursuit for grandness and also grand dynastic design. He never acknowledges his half blood son, and there are some such issues. Now, Epsilon is often seen as a supreme modernist fiction because of its open-endedness and also multiple perspectives. So, in the passage that we just did, Miss Rosa Coalfield, she is commenting on Thomas Sutpen's. Likewise, several people comment on and building. So, the fragmented comments on the character of Thomas Sutpen is something that the writers and the artists of that period were very fond of using, most famously Citizen Kane by Orson Welles, and in the movie the character of the dead man, the dead wealthy man, that is Charles Foster Kane, is built up, constructed by bits and pieces, by narratives of different people. Faulkner received the Nobel Prize in 1949, and number 14 is D, Absolutism, which is generally used in conjunction with some European monarchs during the transition from feudalism to capitalism, and monarchs were described as absolute. Okay, so this was especially visible in the 16th to 19th century, characterized by the ending of feudal partitioning, consolidation of power with the monarch, rise of the state power, unification of state laws, and a decrease in the influence of the church and the nobility. We have been doing a lot of British history, if you remember our initial classes, and Henry VIII was almost like an absolute monarch. Number 15 is C, enlightenment, and number 16 is B. That passage is by Samuel Beckett, The Unnameable, that is the name of the play. Now, it is a postmodernist work. We have done that, postmodernism as opposed to modernism, or later developments in modernism, tendencies that have influenced literature, art, music, cinema, architecture, philosophy, and other arts from 50s, 60s and 70s, also in 80s. Two of the open-endedness is of course one thing, which was a characteristic feature of modernism also, but in postmodernism you find disarticulation. People are not able to articulate themselves properly, appropriately. Fracture. Fracture of what? Communication, a fracture of the plot, fracture of the grand narrative. Okay, so this is postmodernism goes beyond modernism. Postmodernism are also they look very suspiciously at anything which is rational. So, the other day we were talking about the unreliable narrator, right, which is again a very distinctive feature of postmodernism. Postmodernism makes us understand, one of these key feature here is the silence. So, people like Harold Pinter and Samuel Beckett, they are the supreme practitioners of the art of silence. People are inarticulate and also silent, and they feel that there is more communication in this kind of disarticulation and silence. The silence of Beckett as opposed to the excesses of Marcus or Marquis de Sade, okay, the great sadomasochist Marquis de Sade. So, the excesses, so somewhere there. So, postmodernism sort of manifests the two constructs, the silence and the excesses. We were talking the other day about David Lodge, who is not just a great novelist, but also an eminent critic, who mentions how in Beckett's silences we find the element of the postmodernist condition. So, in this particular passage that you have just seen from The Unnameable, from Beckett's play, 1953 play, this passage helps us to understand the postmodernist fragmentation and randomness. Number 17 is A, Sturm and Drang. It is a German word for storm and stress. Okay, wild feelings, in other words, very simplistically put. So, this was sort of a German literary movement of the late 18th century, and it celebrated nature the way the British romantics, the English romantics did, and also not just the nature, but also human feelings, human individuality. We have seen all this in transcendentalism and British or English romanticism. They sort of revolted against the extreme enlightenment and reason and the cult of rationalism. People like Goethe and Schiller, these are the German writers, they began their careers as prominent members of this movement, Sturm and Drang. So, they were called the writers of Sturm and Drang. Of course, later on they shifted or they changed their positions. The exponents of the Sturm and Drang were profoundly influenced by the writings and thoughts of Rousseau and Johann George Hammam. Okay, so these are again great German. Rousseau was French, and Johann George Hammam, who was a German philosopher, who held the basic verities of existence were to be experienced through faith and experience of the senses rather than rationality and excessive logic. That is what enlightenment taught us. The literature with Sturm and Drang has an anti-aristocratic slant and places values on the humble, just like Wordsworth and Coleridge propounded in their lyrical ballads. Also places value on those on nature and intensity and feelings. In music, the symphonies of Mozart are example of this tendency. Now, these German writers who came under the influence of Sturm and Drang were also influenced by the works of the English poet Edward Young, and also the poetry of someone called James Macpherson, who is associated with the Ocean poetry. All these works you should know, and also the works of Shakespeare that were translated in German. So, these young writers were immensely influenced by these writers. Goethe, of course, was one of the earliest practitioners, and his novel The Sorrows of Young Werther, The Sorrows of Young Werther is sort of, it epitomizes the spirit of the movement. So, number 18 is C. Hart Crane, and the passage is taken from Hart Crane's poem To the Brooklyn Bridge, and number 19 is B. Modernism. So, it is the genre of modernism, the majestic arcs of the bridge, the Brooklyn Bridge, and it was still being constructed while Hart Crane was writing or penning the poem. So, he would sit in his room, and that would overlook the bridge under construction, and he was immensely moved. And this is interesting to note, because you can remember, or you may remember, a modernist like T.S. Eliot, who was not too much a fan of this kind of industrialization and development, but Hart Crane was. For him, the bridge mirrors the arc of a seagull or seagull's wings in flight, and the bridge's cables are seen as the strings of a great harp. So, there is music, there is symphony, there is nature, there is beauty for Hart Crane. He also shows us the bridge as a man-made wonder, adding to the myth of God. It is an alternative vision of the early 20th century life, signifying a departure from the brooding gloom of European modernism. So, Hart Crane's To the Brooklyn Bridge. So, some places it appears as merely just the bridge. Number 20 is D. No Country for Old Men by Cormac McCarthy, considered by many as the greatest contemporary American novelist. Number 20 is B. The novel is set in Texas. You can look at the cadences of the passage. And number 22 is C. Goethe. The passage or the quotation is by Goethe. Number 23 is Jack Kerouac. Okay, and the title of the book is On the Road. It's a 1957 work, now regarded as the Bible of the Beat generation, and a classic study of American literary counterculture. So, you should know these terms: Beat generation, counterculture. Kerouac made the famous road trip, okay, and in the company of someone called Neil Cassady. Neil Cassady And the book recounts their experiences, and it sort of became a cultural phenomenon. It was published in 1957, and after that it became the cool thing, the in thing for young men, or men who still could do that or had strength in them, to take a cross country visit by the road, America as seen through the road. So, Kerouac and his various friends started the trip from New York to New Orleans, heading towards William S. Burroughs, the writer of The Naked Lunch. Okay, so they headed towards his home, and these experiences are used to tell the story of Kerouac, who in the novel appears as, in the book appears as someone called Sal Paradise, and Cassidy appears as Dean Moriarty, and they invent for themselves a new kind of identity, new life, liberation. The road trip brings liberation to them. They meet new people, they are open minded, all embracing of all kinds of cultures and people and moralities. So, Kerouac uses the autobiographical mode of narration and also combines stream of consciousness technique to tell the story, his story and America's story, a nation that was rapidly clamping down on its cherished ideals of liberty. So, that's what he thought. He demonstrated a sort of free unstructured composition where the author puts down thoughts and feelings without any plan, absolute freedom and spontaneity. It went on to have far reaching influences, and brought into focus a new genre of writing, the road novel, and a new genre of cinema also, the road movie, best characterized or epitomized by Easy Rider. Number 24 is C, is a Tom Stoppard play called Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead. And number 25 is B, the play nods to Hamlet. Again, it is a very postmodernistic kind of play where minor characters from Shakespeare become the major characters here, and Hamlet just makes a fleeting sort of a cameo. So, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, and it is an absurdist play. So, one of the best plays of contemporary times. Number 26 is C, Galileo by Bertolt Brecht. The other day we were doing Brecht also, and the tenor tells you how Marxist it is in its position, and of course that is Brecht, and the tone is rhetorical, 27A. So, he is not questioning in the sense that he is not interrogating just because there are question marks, but he is making a point through the use of those question marks. Number 28 is B, John Fowles, the French lieutenant's woman, okay. And number 29, the most startling aspect of the French lieutenant's woman is its conclusion. So, answer is C, conclusion. The plot of the French lieutenant's woman, Charles Smithson is the hero. He is a paleontologist living on the southwestern coast of England, and he has a fiancée who is very upright, very uptight. Now, he comes in contact with someone called a woman, a mysterious woman called Sarah Woodruff. She is a local governess. People believe that she has been used by a French soldier, but she is still pining away for him. The fourth major figure is not a character, but the author. Now, one of the interesting feature of this novel is that the author is not the all powerful, all knowing, omniscient kind of a character. Early on, he discovers that he has lost control of his characters and plot, and proposes in that case to let them have their own freedom. Okay, so classic death of the author kind of a situation. The story proceeds, although he uses alternative episodes. In one, Charles marries his fiancée, in another he does not. There are multiple endings with the author sometimes turning up to walk among his characters and commenting on their actions. So, that is the way the story is constructed, one of the best known or well loved works of postmodernism. We have been talking quite a lot about German literature, and I thought it is about time that we should do something on Goethe, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, who lived from 1749 to 1832. Please note the date, 1749 to 1832, one of the greatest poets and dramatists, not just of Germany but anywhere. He was also a novelist and scientist. He wrote The Sorrows of Young Werther in 1774. He also wrote something called Wilhelm Meister's Apprenticeship, which comes into the genre of Bildungsroman in 1796. I hope you people know what is Bildungsroman, coming of age Bildungsroman. This is a genre which focuses on the sorrows and lives and trials and tribulations of a young person who comes of age. So, The Sorrows of Young Werther is one, and Wilhelm Meister's Apprenticeship. Wilhelm Meister's Apprenticeship. He also wrote Poetry and Truth from My Life in 1833, and then wrote Iphigenia in Tauris. All these works and details and summaries of these works are freely available, easily available on the net. You have to know that Goethe's life coincides with the period called German Romanticism, and that is important. Late 18th and early 19th century. Musically, it was one of the greatest periods with people like Wagner and Liszt and Beethoven and Schubert, all combining elements from various sources, including folklores and supernaturalism, and composing their immortal melodies, symphonies. Beethoven and Schubert also composed some of Goethe's poems. Goethe was belongs or comes under the broad umbrella of Romanticism. He was interested in subjects beyond the developments in Germany. So, his nationalism was not a narrow nationalism. He coined the term world literature. Many of us are very fond of using this term, but he actually coined the term world literature. He was disillusioned by the idea of the way literature escapes into dreams and illusions. He also did the same thing in Young Werther, and he wanted to experiment with a different form and theme, and thus came up with Faust, his magnum opus. There are two parts. One was published in 1808 and another in 1832. Faust is a drama in two parts. One is called Scholar's Tragedy and second is called Gretchen's Tragedy. Scholar's Tragedy and Gretchen, Gretchen's Tragedy. As you might know, the theme is man's desire to transcend his limitations. The story has its origin in the legends of 15th and 16th centuries. As the other day we were discussing that it is a German lore, a folklore. It is a German folklore. And the story of a doctor who indulged in black magic. It has been, who sells his soul or who sort of mortgages his soul to the devil in exchange for worldly pleasure in some versions, and in some versions it is a bet and it is a wager, as in Goethe's Faust. Earlier the legend was adapted by Christopher Marlowe, the Elizabethan dramatist, in his Dr. Faustus. Faust, as you know, is a scholar whose good works as a university teacher and physician have earned him, in God's eyes, he has earned heaven. He is a proof that God has created a phenomenal creature and an extremely worthy man. But Mephistopheles, he sort of places a wager or a bet with the Lord. He mocks Faust for his dedication to God and suggests that this thirst for knowledge is a weakness, and he can break Faust, he can break him away from God and his ways. So, what happens is that lured or tempted by Mephistopheles, Faust sort of mortgages his soul to Mephistopheles, and that is the tragedy. Faust is also seen as a drama of modernity. It jettisons the Aristotelian concept of the three unities, and unity is just derived from the theme, modern dynamic of striving, to strive for encyclopedic breadth of vision, expression and knowledge. So, this what is this knowledge? It could be history, politics, art, religion, philosophy, economics, technology, and that is what he yearns for. So, part 1 is concerned with the little world, and in the second part, which has a much greater and broader scope, he focuses on the great world. So, with this we end, and I would like you to keep revising the literature that we have been doing so far, we have been referring to. Please remember that in this course it was not possible that we should we should complete or look in depth at each and every author or movement or work, but what we have tried to do through several practice tests to give you an overview of the major landmarks, the major writers and the major works, the major movements in literature, and not just British or American literature, but literature from, that is what we have attempted, or we strove to give you literature from all parts of the world. So, perhaps it was a bird's eye view, but I hope it was useful, and please try to take this further. Thank you very much.